So if we're looking at Star Trek's 2, 3, and 4 as a trilogy, the core of the original set of Star Trek movies, as most people tend to do, we discover certain universal truths. I think it's fairly much agreed upon that Star Trek 2, critically and objectively, is the best film. We covered that in its review. Star Trek 3 is usually regarded as the weakest of them. We covered it in that review. And Star Trek 4, I don't think it's exaggeration to say that Star Trek 4 is the most beloved of the Star Trek movies. And I believe that even though, that the movie nerd or whatever that lurks inside all of us, that gives us the desire to always go, oh, Star Trek 2 is the best, Star Trek 2 is the best. But I think if a lot of those people are really being honest, I think they would probably admit to you that while Star Trek 2 may be the best, Star Trek 4 is probably the one they've watched the most. And with good reason. Star Trek 4, I think Star Trek 4 is in a tie for my favorite of the original set, and we'll talk about the other one later. But it's the first one I remember watching on my own. Like I said, I think the first one I ever saw was 5. We went for Father's Day with my dad, and when I started getting into Star Trek, and my friends were into it, and I wanted to get into it too, we went to Blockbuster. Yes, folks, Blockbuster. Young children, ask your parents. And the first one I ever rented to watch all the way through was Star Trek 4. And I just fell in love with it, like many people did. Because it is a Star Trek movie beloved by people who aren't Star Trek fans. It's kind of funny, I talked about how Star Trek 2 had this challenge of trying to continue on the story from the show, please the old fans, and introduce the franchise to new fans. But I would wager that Star Trek 4 is really the one that got more people into Star Trek, because it is just such a delightful, enjoyable film. It is such a jump from number 3. And what's interesting is, I think one of the reasons for that is because I think all the things I criticized in Star Trek 3 are the exact opposite here in Star Trek 4. So let's talk about these things. Before I do that, before I get going, I should say this. I should say this about all the forgotten gems and these ones that I'm doing, and I never have, but I should say there are going to be spoilers. I've never made that declaration, I think, with any of these, because I assumed that most people have heard of these movies, and especially with these films, I assume most people have. But a comment on the last video made me realize that not everybody has. So there are spoilers in this, and there are going to be spoilers going forward. So if you are wanting to experience the Star Trek films for yourself without any kind of outside information, then go do that and then come back and watch. But if you don't mind that, I'm going to be talking about spoilers here. You kind of have to discuss these films and what went on in them. So I just wanted to lay that out there first. There are going to be spoilers. You're warned. So let's dive right in. Before we get to analyzing the film itself, let's talk about where our characters are and what is the story of this next step in the Star Trek franchise. So Star Trek 4 picks up exactly where Star Trek 3 left off. So Spock's mind and body have been reunited. The crew of the late USS Enterprise are in exile on Vulcan in a stolen Klingon bird of prey, basically waiting for Spock to be well enough to travel so they can head back to Earth to face the consequences of what they did in order to rescue him in the previous film. However, while they're gone, suddenly a huge probe appears over Earth. It's a huge black cylinder with this weird ball floating in it, and it's making these weird noises, sending this signal out. And it's a probe of immense power that is causing all this damage to Earth, its technology, its atmosphere. Basically, it's going to fuck up the whole planet. And no one can figure out how to destroy the probe or how to contact the probe or whatever. The crew of the Enterprise, on its way back, makes the discovery that if you listen to the probe's signal underwater, it's actually the song of humpback whales. So the probe is trying to talk to humpbacks. The problem being, humpbacks have been extinct for several hundred years. So the crew of the Enterprise do the next logical thing, and it's time travel time. One slingshot around the sun later, they are back in then-present 1986 and looking for several humpback whales to bring back to the 23rd century, and as Dr. McCoy so eloquently puts it, tell this probe what to go do with itself. So, that's the basic story. And I think the story is a good place to start when we're talking about why this film works so well. The story and the director. So Leonard Nimoy is back in the director's chair. And basically what happened is that after the success of Star Trek 3, the producers told him basically, go make the movie you want. So that makes a huge difference. Directorially and creatively, there is a huge difference when someone hands you a script and says you have to do it this way, and this is all the things you need to make sure you include in it, and when someone hands you a script or tells you to go write a script and says do what you want. I can tell you that from personal experience. There's just a great deal more freedom and just a lot more creative juices flowing when you can just tell a story and not have to worry about it fitting in or tying up loose ends or anything of that nature. So I think right away that is a big element to why this film works so well, is the story is really, really good. It is simple, but effective. Utilizing the best elements of Trek in new ways. For instance, one of the first things Leonard Nimoy said he wanted to do is he knew he wanted to do a time travel movie. For whatever reason, he thought it would be fun. Now, normally in Star Trek, when you're dealing with time travel, it's usually one of the things of they land at a very historically important moment in history, or they're there and they meet somebody, you know, who turns out that they're going to be the great grandfather or mother of someone really important down the line, or it's there to comment very heavily on, you know, that time period and the short-sightedness of that time period. And none of that happens in this movie. The time travel is there to basically take our characters out of their comfort zone and put them in a new situation. They're not worried about screwing up the future, so there's none of this butterfly effect shit. They're not on an episode of the Magic School Bus where they bump into every historically important person of the time. You know, they're walking down the street and go, oh, hello, President Reagan. You know, oh, hello, Gorbachev. You know, we just so happen to be here. You know, no, none of that happens. Another thing about this film, in terms of the story, there is no villain. It's the only Star Trek film that has no antagonist. The probe is an obstacle. Spock even has the line that I find it illogical that its methods or its motives are hostile. So the probe is not trying to fuck everything up. It's just doing it. So I'm hoping I can be heard over all this. The rain is coming down pretty hard right now. So if not, Sorry for the bad audio. So there's no villain to fight. There's nothing to be punched or shot or blown up to solve your problem. You have a mission, you have tasks that need to be performed, and you go do it. You give these people specific tasks in a foreign time and let them go. And like I say, there is no real political statements here. There's obviously the ecological, very earth-friendly, don't hunt whales kind of thing going on. But it's not like an episode of Captain Planet. It's mentioned once or twice. There are a couple times when they have a line and it sounds a little hokey and you're like, all right, pull back. But for the most part, it's just Earth in danger, we need this. And that's it. The message is there, but it isn't shoved into your face. They're not making any huge political statements about what was going on at the time. The time travel gimmick is there mostly to have the characters be kind of confounded by little annoyances of the time period. Things like needing exact change to ride a bus. And how does a civilization that has no money, work with the concept of money all of a sudden? Little things like that. So I think that's a smart way to go. And let's get to the real meat and potatoes. Why is this film so beloved? Why is it the one everybody knows? Because it is delightful. It is fun and it is funny. This is the funniest Star Trek movie ever. So much so that I've heard people describe it as a comedy. The comic moments in this are such that are so many and so well revered. I can't possibly list them all. I'm talking about the list now. But Spock trying to learn how to swear, Scotty working with a Macintosh and talking into the mouse, Bones going around a 20th century hospital like he's been dropped into the Dark Ages where they still use leeches. And I think that's another great thing, and why the comedy works so well in this one, whereas in other Star Trek films that try to incorporate comedy, it tends to fall a little flat sometimes, is I think the comedy is very character and situation specific. Bones in the hospital is a great example. He's not just out there making jokes, like Bugs Bunny. He's making jokes that are specific to his expertise and his character. Same thing with Scotty not knowing how to work a Macintosh. He's an engineer. He works with the computer all the time. And working with one that you don't just talk to, how is he going to deal with that? I think that's another thing. I mentioned this in Star Trek 3 is, once again, a lot of the supporting characters, the other members of the crew, are allowed to have moments to shine. Kirk and Spock are, as always, our focus, but Scotty gets something to do, Chekhov gets something to do, Bones gets something to do. Sulu and, once again, Uhura are kind of left out of that. They do things, but there's not really a joke or a story arc really specific to them. The closest Sulu gets is flying a helicopter and accidentally turning on the windshield. And Uhura really gets nothing. I don't understand, and it never really occurred to me just how much of the short end of the stick in these movies she gets a lot of the time, but she really does. She really doesn't get anything to do. But the humor is situation and character driven, and it works so well. I've seen this movie God knows how many times, and I still laugh at it. It's still that funny, that charming. You know, again, character and situation informed. You know, Chekhov with his famous, "We're looking for the nuclear vessels." You know, having a Russian character in 1986 walking around asking people, "Where can I find the nuclear vessels?" You know, and people's reaction to it, funny. We got to give a big shout out to the special effects in this film. Now, the Trek films have always had very good special effects, but this one, specifically with the whales, because you'd think if they're back in, you know, then modern day, that there'd be fewer special effects you got to worry about. You don't got to worry about ships or space or explosions. But how do you show two full-grown humpback whales as central MacGuffins in a sci-fi story? And man, the special effects, there is some file footage of some whales in open water, but the most part, there is not a single live whale in this film. It's all mechanical. They bring in guys from ILM. They brought in a guy who was who worked at Disney World. A lot of it is models and electronic, you know, creatures, and it looks flawless. It's amazing how good it looks even now. There are some green screen shots that are a little questionable, but the shots of the whales, let me tell you how good these special effects are. When this movie opened, like the day after it opened, the head of Paramount was getting angry calls from animal rights groups and whale groups going, "How dare you get in there with whales, and how dare you torment," because the only way you could get whales, you know, that kind of shot, is to actually get in with them and get the camera real close, you know, and they're like, "How dare you do this, you know, how horrible," and they're like, "There's not a single live whale shot in this movie," you know, but people believed it was real. It's that good. I think another thing that really benefits this movie, so again, looking at Star Trek 3 and just seeing how everything seems to be the exact opposite, unifying themes. We have the unifying theme that we're going with, the ecological message, the mission that needs to be accomplished. So everything is in service of that, of the overall goal or theme. So we've got that. But I think another thing is that this film, it just feels like people were way more relaxed. Leonard Nimoy feels way more relaxed as a director. I think this is a fantastic directed film. I think he directed this masterfully. It's amazing how good it is. And I think this is only his second movie, and especially when you consider how jarring number 3 was. But this one is really solid. It's directorially, it's phenomenal. I also think, and just listening to the interviews and everything, it seems like there wasn't as much tension in this one. I mentioned it in the last review that, you know, the fights between the Star Trek cast are legendary, you know, and the egos involved, particularly, you know, Leonard Nimoy and especially William Shatner, you know, those are not small egos clashing. And it seemed, nobody wanted to come out and say it, but it did seem like there was a lot of ego clashing on Star Trek 3. Star Trek 4, it does not feel that way, and all the interviews are very positive. Everybody's very happy about it. You know, they say they had a lot of fun. Just like you can tell a show where there are big problems backstage or there's a conflict, you can also tell a show where the cast and director and everybody are just having a ball and are all on the same page. And it feels like this time they got there, that they're on the same page and things are moving in the right direction. Is this movie perfect? No, it is not. Let's talk about some of the things that don't quite work. I talked already about Uhura not really getting anything to do in the film. I think that is a problem, and a recurring one. I talked about how great the comedy is, and the comedy is very, again, character and situation specific, but there are times when it's going a little too far. There's a moment where Chekhov has been captured trespassing on the naval ship, the USS Enterprise, and he's being questioned by an FBI agent. And the question and answer thing going back and forth is very Abbott and Costello-esque. Let's start at the top. Let's start with name. You mean my name? No, my name. Well, I do not know your name. It's like they have shown us that sarcasm exists in the 23rd century. There's no reason, even if the phrasing is off, there's no reason he shouldn't understand what is being asked of him. And it makes, you could argue that maybe Chekhov is just jerking the guy around so that he doesn't reveal anything because he's from the future and all this. But they don't play it that way. So it just makes Chekhov come off looking really stupid. It's a funny scene, but it is a bit too much into the yuck, 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 yuck kind of camp. Continuity-wise, there is an issue. Because they're using the same bird of prey that they captured in Star Trek 3, and yet the bridge configuration is 100% different. Now, I suppose you could make the argument that in the 3 months they were on Vulcan that they totally reworked the bridge, but why wouldn't they rework the bridge to look more like a Federation bridge? That doesn't make any sense. So, minor continuity error there. Honestly, there's not a lot bad to say about this movie. It fits and it works. Everything about it works. Even the only other thing I could say, I remember when I first saw it, this bugged me. As I see it now, it doesn't. And that there is no explanation as to what the probe is, where it comes from, who sent it. And it's set up to feel like that's a much bigger mystery. But it's never brought up again. Now, as a kid watching this, I hated that because you want to know. You're used to everything being explained. Watching it now, I think that's one of the high points of the film, is that you don't know, and we never do know. I know they did, I know there was a expanded universe book called Probe, where they followed it and figured out what it was. But nobody counts those as part of the canon, so I don't count that. But I actually think that's a point in its favor, is this, it's a mysterious thing. It's not for man to know what it is. One of the stories they tell in the interviews is that one of the production notes they got is that when the probe is first seen and it's making these noises, the studio wanted them to put subtitles under it to say what it's saying. And they said, we're not supposed to know. The audience isn't supposed to know what it's saying. That's the whole fucking point. It's not a message for us. I think that's another thing as we talk about, the good in this movie. I love movies that take real mysteries and find interesting solutions to them. For instance, there's a Doctor Who episode with Agatha Christie, and Agatha Christie disappeared for a few days, and then reappeared and had no memory of what had happened. That's a true thing. And they said, well, what if aliens, And one of the great mysteries, I haven't kept up with the studies, but I remember we studied it a lot when I was in elementary school. We studied whales and all of this, is that we don't know why they sing. That the male sings, another male picks it up and sings it, and then it carries it along. And they change the song every year. And nobody knows what that is about. And I love it that they said, well, what if that is them sending signals to whomever for about whatever, I really enjoy that. Look, I could go on and on and on about how great this movie is. There's not a lot to criticize. It is pretty damn perfect, And there's a reason why this one is so beloved in the Star Trek canon, and why it's so beloved just by ordinary fans. Even though it's the fourth one in the series, I think it's the one you need, and it's building off a lot of the things that happened in the previous two movies. I think it's the one you need the least amount of knowledge of Trek to enjoy. It's just a fun movie. One of the things, again, the producers said when they got the first draft of the script, they said we'd make this movie even if it wasn't Star Trek, because it's that good. And I am inclined to agree with them. I think this is a high point of the Trek franchise that it's going to be struggling to get back to for a very long time. People say Star Trek II is the high watermark. I don't know if I agree. I think Star Trek IV is actually the high watermark. So, yeah. So, that's my opinion on Star Trek IV. Maybe not an original opinion, but still a valid one. So if you are looking to start Star Trek, I had somebody ask me where do I start, and the answer is anywhere, really. Yeah, you can start with number 2 and go from there if you want the story in a chronological way. But if you want something that's going to be fun and enjoyable and really suck you into the world, check out Star Trek IV. I think it's, even if you don't watch any of the other films, you'll enjoy this one. All right, so that is it for Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home. But we got a lot of Trek left to go, because once you've arrived home, where else is there to go but into the final frontier? And we'll see you next time for Star Trek V. So, live long and prosper, and drive safe, and I will see you at the movies.